Our final speaker for today is Bob Sanford. And he's first going to take a moment and kind of summarize and reflect on what we've heard today. And I don't know how he's going to do that because we've heard a lot of great stuff. But then he is going to talk about the power of stories and storytelling in these troubled times that we find ourselves in. Bob holds the Global Water Futures Chair in Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water. He is a member of the Canmore Club, correct? Oh, your wife is, okay. Well, you are too then. Please join me in welcoming Bob Sanford.
Well, first of all, what a sensational day, I have to say. And whew, I can still eat beef. So thank you for the kind introductions, Steve, and it's an honor to be invited. And please allow me to begin by extending the very best wishes of the United Nations to all. Do I need that?
It's not working too hot.
Okay, take it then. In accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I wish to acknowledge from the outset that all peoples contribute to the diversity and richness of civilizations and cultures, which constitute the common heritage of humankind. And it is to the common heritage of all of humanity, past and present, that I wish to direct my remarks today. And that said, if I may, in the interest of the future, I'd like to make an observation on the intention and potential force of the land acknowledgements which are now becoming common around the world. While this new practice is of great importance in and of itself as a sign of respect, it can be even more, and it can do more. Land acknowledgement should be seen as more than the politics of recognizing historic territoriality. We forget this sometimes. The first and foremost goal of acknowledgement should be about fulfilling existing treaty promises. Such acknowledgement, however, can be much more than about the past. Such acknowledgement should also be about the present and the future. It should acknowledge the relationship between land and people. It should be about our common intention on the landscapes we share. It should be about how each of us now will add on a new layer of experience, knowledge, and narrative to the map of place. And to that, I will have much more to say in a few minutes. But let me acknowledge at this point my respect for how Rotary, which by way of fora like this one, is evolving in the direction of reinvention and relevance in a new era of reconciliation and decolonization in the midst of a climate emergency. A sustainable and post-colonial Canada is possible. We must all work toward that future. So in that context, please allow me to explain my work. The foundation of my work and the work of the entire global and water and climate community begins with science. And it seems to me that the commandments of science can be reduced to two: tell the truth and stand up for all humanity and for the planet now and generations into the future. Good science involves not just sharing knowledge about the world, it is a candle we light when we want to see and be warmed by the truth. But as we've seen in the last year, and again as we've heard so clearly today, Scientific knowledge alone will not be enough to get us through the bottleneck in which we presently find ourselves in the human journey. More than at any other time in history, we need to braid together all of humanity's ways of knowing and caring. We need to bring indigenous and local wisdom, as well as scientific knowledge and citizen action, to bear on the challenge of ensuring sustainable human presence on this planet. I'll have much more to say about this in the context of the future of the economy, but first, a reality check. I'm going to ask you to be patient for a few minutes. I want to get the painful stuff out of the way so that we can arrive at hope for the future, for there's much even in this troubled time, as we've heard today, that we can look forward to. So what are the circumstances we face telling us? I don't have to tell anyone here that our global circumstances have changed. We now look out on the virus, war, and climate-addled world. So let's start with the virus. We should not forget what we're dealing with here. We are dealing with organisms that were present on this planet 250 million years before the first multicellular life appeared on Earth. It is estimated that there are 1.7 million viruses that could, if they mutated, threaten human health. And once again, as you've heard today, this is an example of an old global social justice and equity issue. Not counting those who refuse them, 1 in 3 people on Earth has yet to receive even a single vaccination. More variants will appear, and to think otherwise is wishful thinking. The solution? Press to get everyone vaccinated. And if we did that now, we'd be heralding a new age of public health security on this planet. Reality check. That's not likely to happen. Another reality check. COVID and climate change are a tag team. Neither one of them is going to go away soon. And unless we start moving far more rapidly than we are now, we are not going to keep warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius or even below 2 degrees Celsius. And it's no longer just the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change or the UN that is telling us this. And it's no longer just climate models. Global energy use models are telling us the same thing. While we promised a 40% reduction in carbon emissions by 2030, all we have been able to do so far is to slow the rate of the continuing growth of these emissions. And whether we want to hear it or not, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change reports that despite clear evidence that the status quo is not working, and continuing to pursue it may be self-terminating, examples of maladaptation are emerging widely in the form of locking into existing vulnerability by way of ongoing investment in the energy structures that got us into trouble in the first place. The IPCC goes on to report that even leaving aside the inevitability of unexpected and unintended consequences, the idea of temporary overshoot, allowing carbon dioxide reductions to wait until the next decade and beyond, so as to allow unproven geoengineering technologies to be perfected, borders on madness. With every increment of temperature rise, we will push the limits of our capacity to adapt. Until a certain point, successful adaptation is going to be very hard to achieve. And you also, all of us saw what happened in the West in 2021. Climate change impacts have arrived 20 to 30 years early. We're in for it, and wherever you live, so are you. And I have to say that traveling as I do, I think we live in a bubble here. Do not underestimate the gravity of this emergency, and do not dismiss the reality of climate anxiety. So, how are we going to get through this? Well, one thing is obvious, is that we need better stories that we can tell to one another about how we should live and how we should relate to one another and to the earth so that we can get through this frightful bottleneck in the human journey, so that we can sustain the human world and the living non-human world as far as possible into the future. So my topic today is not COVID or climate change per se. We just got through all of that. I wish to talk to you today about stories and storytellers, and how important the stories are that we tell ourselves. And perhaps because I so vigorously support reconciliation, I have noticed and am glad that so much is being made lately of Indigenous stories and narratives as enduring cultural traditions we can learn from. And while I agree there's much we can and should learn from Indigenous storytellers, we should not ignore the fact that there are other stories and many other ways of telling them, and we are awash in them. If they're not stories, what then are movies? That said, it cannot be denied that we often tell ourselves the wrong kinds of stories in movies. It won't be alien monsters sent by extragalactic empires seeking our precious resources, or global cabals like Spectre with special weapons that threaten us. It is our own paralyzing sense and habit of entitlement that will not just bring down us, but the rest of the world if we do not pay attention now. Still, they may not be the stories we need to tell ourselves right now, but it cannot be denied either that their popularity continues to demonstrate our society's need for and its love of narrative. And I think of this after listening to an interview with Margaret Atwood, ostensibly on the topic of stories and storytelling, as she celebrated the publication of her new book of poems called Dearly, and a collection of essays entitled Burning Questions. Atwood began the interview by explaining that stories came into existence originally, not unlike song lines, to teach people what to do and not to do and where to go to ensure survival. Stories also delineated the invisible and allowed projections into the future made based on memories of the past and what we knew of the present. Hence, stories of rain gods and other prognostic inventions, and also the invention of marvelous superstitions. But it must not be forgotten either that it has also been in the nature of human beings to use stories to deceive. It did not take long for stories to emerge about enemies. These stories included warnings not just about the dangers of encounters with other species, but also about the untrustworthiness of others of our own species. Stories have also been employed to evil ends. For what purpose, for example, would you keep telling stories about why you had to annually sacrifice children in order to be a good person and serve your gods? And what about stories that appeal to and justify greed and hunger for power? There have been many of those over millennia. Or how about the stories we have told ourselves that reinforce our belief that unlimited economic growth will ultimately bring prosperity to an unlimitedly exploding global population? And I think we know now that there are some real whoppers being told presently. And if you don't think so, watch the movie Don't Look Up. As in the past, stories clearly play a huge role in our contemporary geopolitical circumstances. To hold a nation state together, you need a story in which people can deeply believe. Time and again, we've seen that the moment people don't believe a common story is when things start to fall apart. And the United States is a case in point. The stories that have for more than 2 centuries held the United States together are those that tell of a land of virtuous light. But even that story needed an enemy, a penguin or a joker to America's Batman, if you will. And from 1945 to 1989, the Soviet Union was that enemy. An enemy that surviving cold warriors would like to resurrect in Putin and Russia's recent invasion of Ukraine. But it won't work, of course. The US has become an object lesson in the age-old curse of nations falling prey to the very authoritarianism that these nations told the world they would always protect it from. Currently, the U.S. appears to be poised to self-destruct. A divided country is wrestling over who constitutes and who should constitute the real America. And the bitter fight is over the very soul of the country. And as if this divisiveness were somehow contagious, the same thing is now happening in parts of Canada. The only difference for now is that the stories Canadians tell themselves are different from those Americans have been telling one another. How much longer this will be the case remains to be seen. Our democracy is under threat. And I would submit this to you. Without a strong democracy, we will not be able to adequately address the problems we have discussed here today. So, O Canada, we do stand on guard for thee. And meanwhile, climate change continues to accelerate everywhere, and the story just gets worse and worse. Margaret Atwood foresees that things are going to get nastier as there's less to go around. And one of the things that seems certain is that climate change is going to make food more scarce and humanitarian harder to deliver on the scale, as we heard this morning, a scale necessary to the emergency. Authoritarianism will rise, making greater conflict inevitable. The wars brought about by climate heating will kill more people than the extreme events that warming will generate. So this presents a serious problem for narrative and a serious challenge for storytelling. Atwood sees it in this way. The present narrative is basically that there is no future for a mid-sized, land-based, oxygen-breathing species in a world where there's less oxygen, which is exactly the world we'll face if we kill the oceans and keep altering and heating the Earth's atmosphere. Now, I want to admit to you or submit to you, this is not a story. Stories need characters. Statistics don't work in narrative unless they're turned into characters in a story. And it isn't a story if all the narrative tells us is that we can't agree on what's wrong or what to do about it. What happens when that is the case is that people feel helpless and overwhelmed. Without a guiding story, they say, how are we supposed to act? And because they don't know what to do, they don't want to look. And instead, they simply turn away. So Margaret Atwood is right. We need a better story. But here we cannot but return to the lessons we might learn from Indigenous stories and storytelling. As my First Nation colleague Tim Patterson recently reminded me, as a society, we need to commit ourselves to creating ourselves new and better stories. But before we do that, we should remember the ones we've already been told. And Tim Patterson's right, as we're speakers today, which means there's a lot of good work to do. If non-human voices are to be restored to their proper place, and they must be allowed to share their stories, and that's what we know now, and now we see science agrees. Our greatest hope, and the hope I wish to bring you today, the greatest hope for our future is hope that comes from nature itself, from what science has recently revealed about the deeper workings of natural systems. The recently scientifically validated discovery of non-human sentience and broader intelligence in the natural world offers the greatest potential for transformation in our understanding of the natural world since the last Renaissance. Canadian Suzanne Simard and others around the world have offered peer-reviewed research outcomes that demonstrate that trees can possess sentience and that old-growth forests can exhibit forms of intelligence over time frames until now imperceptible to humans. And if this is true of ancient forests, what of other ecosystems? What of oceans? And how can we share in this unfathomable knowing in time to save these systems, and in so doing, save ourselves? Trent Fox this afternoon nailed it. In this, we see that Indigenous people have been right all along in insisting that long-term human survival has to be predicated on an ethic that foregrounds the familial instinct to protect all our relatives. That is to say, the entire spectrum of non-human kin, including rivers, mountains, animals, and the spirits of the land. It is the vitality of the place itself that creates commonalities between people who dwell on it, no matter what their origin. And in its simplicity and power, the idea of protecting all our relatives may be the key to creating bridges between peoples across the globe. The reemergence of this simple concept could mark the most important reset in the last 500 years. And in its power, it may well be the key to creating bridges between all of us. And isn't that what Rotary exists to do? So, what are the takeaways? Much of humanity lives today as colonists once did, viewing the world as though it were an inert entity that exists primarily to be exploited and profited from with the aid of technology and science. Yet, even the scientists are now, and scientists are struggling to keep up and keep pace with the hidden forces that are manifesting themselves in climatic events of unprecedented violence. And as these events intensify, they add ever greater resonance to the voices who have stubbornly continued to insist that non-humans can, do, and must speak. It is essential now, as a prospect of planetary catastrophe comes ever closer, that non-human voices be restored to our stories. The fate of humans and the fate of all our relatives depends on it. And I think this is a great burden now that rests upon all of us involved in telling our stories and caring about the world. To us falls the task of imaginatively restoring agency and voice to non-humans so that together we can reaffirm our humanity and restore the world. As with all the most important endeavors in human history, this is a task that is once aesthetic and political. And because of the magnitude of the crisis that besets the planet, it is now freighted with the most pressing moral urgency. All the speakers today affirmed that what we most urgently need is a fresh dream of who we are, one which tells us how to act, new stories about taking care of one another and what we have that drive us to take appropriate action. And as part of this new narrative, we also need to create a new sense of time that extends forward to include future generations. And right now, finding that story may be our most urgent collective action. It's not going to be easy. Dealing with the threat of global heating in this climate is like trying to land a plane in a hurricane. And as it happens, it falls to us, all of us who care about this planet, to do that. We must fly and land that plane. It's up to us to find the words and the ways to prevent our society from falling pell-mell, every man for himself, into a future we neither planned nor desire. And as we saw today, this could be our finest hour. In conclusion, we're at a crossroads and we're running out of time. We need to stop this heartbreaking and utterly unnecessary war, get on top of this pandemic, and get ahead of climate disruption before it gets ahead of us. What we urgently need now is a second, new, and very different enlightenment. But no enlightenment can proceed without a renaissance. We, all of us, need to be that next renaissance, to be that new and wiser beginning. We saw today that this is still a time when new ideas brought forward by a new generation can have outsized impact. Better world is possible. To make that world possible, however, we clearly need to harness the energy, clear-sighted intelligence, and courage of our youth. But we can't put it all on our youth. We have met these people today. We have heard their stories. They are our future, and our generation must offer them the moral and financial support they need so that they can keep telling and retelling their stories by every possible means. Hope is not something someone can give you. It is something you earn. And today we've seen what it means to create and share hope. Hope for humanitarian compassion, hope for reconciliation with one another and with the living planet, hope for climate action, hope for just transition away from fossil reliance and relief from plastic pollution, hope for afforestation, hope for restorative agriculture, hope for sustainability, hope for the future. And we see from this is not the end of the world. It is only the beginning of another. And let's make this a better one. We see from today that this is a transformational moment, not just for each of you or for Rotary, but for all of us, for all of humanity. Let us seize this moment. Let the Renaissance begin here, now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob, for your insightful review of what you heard today and the importance of storytelling and the importance of change. The shelter box donation on behalf of Bob was sponsored by the Rotary Club of Canmore.